One shot? Or two? In September 1911, the most powerful man in Russia, Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, was assassinated in Kiev. The killer, agent provocateur Dmitry Bogrov, was captured at the scene and executed 10 days later. The case was closed. But what if the official version is just a smokescreen? What if the assassin was not a lone wolf, but a pawn in a terrible game played at the very top? For more than a century, historians have been searching for the answer to the main question: who was really behind the assassination that changed the course of Russian history? We will examine all the versions, study witness statements, and look into secret archives to get closer to solving the mystery of the second shot. Kiev, early 20th century. The city is a truly Russian-European metropolis, where ancient streets, merchant mansions, and sparkling cathedral domes intertwine. Boulevards and squares are filled with carriages and passers-by, while the local intelligentsia discusses reforms and political turmoil tearing the empire apart. Kiev is preparing for a grand event: the centenary of the abolition of serfdom, the arrival of the Tsar, and a demonstration of freedom and progress. The atmosphere is both festive and tense. The streets are patrolled by Cossacks and soldiers on the orders of the head of the Imperial Security Service. Information hysteria is fueled by rumors of possible terrorist attacks. Every guest, every official, every alley is viewed with suspicion. Local newspapers analyze whether there will be attempts on the lives of high-ranking officials, since bloody political assassinations have been committed here more than once. However, everyone is really waiting for the appearance of Stolypin, a legendary figure, reformer, and enemy of the revolutionaries. The parade square in front of the Kiev Opera House, where the main event is to take place, is lit by thousands of lamps. Crowds fill the boulevards, and the police carefully control access. The city itself seems to be holding its breath. Events that will forever change the course of the country's history may take place here. It is here that the path to the tragedy that tore the empire apart begins. Through the tense, festive atmosphere, through total control, through the fear and hope of the people. And it is this setting that becomes the perfect backdrop for one of the most mysterious tragedies of the Russian Empire: the assassination of Pyotr Stolypin. Pyotr Arkadyevich Stolypin, a figure who still provokes fierce debate. For some, he was the last defender of the empire, a brilliant reformer who could have saved Russia from disaster. For others, he was a cruel executioner, the author of the Stolypin Ties, who suppressed the First Russian Revolution. But who was he really? Tall, stately, with a piercing gaze and an indomitable will, he gave the impression of a man forged from steel. His famous phrase, thrown in the face of radical deputies in the State Duma, "You will not intimidate me," became his life credo. He was truly fearless. Having survived 10 assassination attempts by 1911, he continued on his path with a determination that some called heroism and others recklessness. The basis of his policy was the agrarian reform begun in 1906. Its essence was simple and revolutionary at the same time: to destroy the peasant community, which had stifled initiative for centuries, and create a new class of strong, independent farmers and landowners. Stolypin believed that these people, once they had land and freedom to farm, would become the most reliable support for the throne and a barrier to revolution. He said, "Give the state 20 years of peace, both internal and external, and you will not recognize Russia as it is today." But he was not given peace. His reforms hurt the interests of too many people. Left-wing radicals, the socialist revolutionaries and social democrats, saw him as their worst enemy. The success of his agrarian policy deprived them of their main support base, the discontented and impoverished peasantry. A strong and prosperous farmer would not go out and make a revolution. Therefore, Stolypin was their #1 target. But he also had enemies on the right. The extreme right-wing monarchists, the Black Hundreds, and the court Camarilla saw him as an upstart, a destroyer of centuries-old foundations. His reforms, in their opinion, undermined the power of the local nobility and the traditional communal way of life, which they considered the basis of Russian life. They whispered in the Tsar's ear that Stolypin was too powerful, too independent, and that he was aiming to become a dictator. His conflict with Grigory Rasputin was particularly intense. The Prime Minister considered the holy old man a charlatan whose influence on the royal family was detrimental to the monarchy, and he managed to have him temporarily expelled from St. Petersburg. This earned him a mortal enemy in the person of Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. By 1911, Stolypin found himself in political isolation. He was a stranger to everyone. Revolutionaries hated him for suppressing riots, liberals for his harshness, and conservatives for his radicalism. Even Tsar Nicholas II, who had once completely trusted his minister, began to be burdened by his power and independence. Stolypin did not travel to Kiev simply as the head of government. He traveled as a man walking on a knife's edge, knowing that dozens of eyes were watching his every move, and not all of them were friendly. He was a target, and he was well aware of it. By 1911, the circle of enemies around Stolypin had tightened to the limit. The threats came not from one, but from several completely different and even hostile centers of power. This was not just political opposition, it was a multi-layered web of conspiracies, where each player pursued their own goals. But the common point of intersection was the figure of the Prime Minister. The first and most obvious threat was the revolutionary terrorists, primarily the combat organization of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, or the SRs. For them, Stolypin was enemy #1, the embodiment of the hated regime. His agrarian reform, which was pulling the rug out from under revolutionary propaganda, made him a prime target. The SRs were masters of political terror. Their leader, Boris Savinkov, a cold-blooded and calculating organizer, turned murder into a conveyor belt. They acted boldly, fanatically, and were ready to die for their ideals. They had dozens of attempts on the lives of officials, governors, and ministers to their credit. The explosion on Aptekarsky Island in 1906, which killed dozens of innocent people and left Stolypin himself miraculously alive, was their handiwork. They would stop at nothing to remove him from the political scene. They hunted him down, tracked his every move, and he knew it. But there was another, far more insidious and less visible threat, from the right. These were extreme right-wing monarchists united in the union of the Russian people and other Black Hundred organizations. In words, they were ardent defenders of autocracy, but in reality, they were representatives of the reactionary part of the nobility and clergy who were terrified of Stolypin's reforms. He was destroying the world they knew. His law on religious tolerance, his attempts to limit local arbitrariness, his agrarian reform, which undermined the economic power of the landowners, all this aroused a deep, hidden hatred in them. They saw him as a destroyer of foundations, a careerist who, with his energetic activity, eclipsed the Tsar himself. Their weapons were not bombs and revolvers, but intrigues, denunciations, and behind-the-scenes whispering in the corridors of power. They had direct access to the emperor and, more importantly, to Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. It was through her that they turned the monarch against his most active minister. Stolypin's conflict with Rasputin was the peak of this struggle. The prime minister thought the old man was a con artist who was messing with the royal family, so he got him kicked out of the capital. This basically sealed his fate with the empress, who became his worst enemy. Finally, the third, most mysterious and dangerous force was part of his own department, the police department and the security division. The Okhrana was a state within a state, a world of double agents, provocateurs, and careerists. The head of the Kiev security department, Nikolai Kulyabko, his immediate superior and comrade of the Minister of Internal Affairs, Pavel Kurlov, who was responsible for the safety of the sovereign in Kiev. All these people were part of a complex system of intrigue. Could any of them have wanted Stolypin dead? The elimination of such a powerful figure opened up incredible career prospects. In addition, Stolypin had launched an investigation into illegal spending in the Okhrana, which could have hit many high-ranking officials. In these murky waters, where provocateurs worked for revolutionaries and revolutionaries turned out to be police agents, anything was possible. Thus, by the time he arrived in Kiev, Stolypin was caught in a vice. On the one hand, there were fanatical terrorists thirsting for his blood. On the other, there were influential court intriguers who dreamed of his resignation. And between them stood his own security detail, whose loyalty was highly questionable. He was completely alone against everyone. The evening of September 1st, 1911, the Kiev City Theater, an architectural gem, shines with thousands of lights. Inside are the cream of Kiev society and guests from the capital. Rimsky-Korsakov's The Tale of Tsar Sultan is being performed. This is not just a performance. It is the culmination of the celebrations marking the opening of the monument to Alexander II. In the imperial box are Emperor Nicholas II with his daughters, Grand Duchesses Olga and Tatiana. In the hall are ministers, generals, and the aristocracy. The atmosphere is both solemn and slightly tense. Security is at an unprecedented level. The entire theater is cordoned off by troops and police. Inside, hundreds of plainclothes Okhrana agents are stationed throughout the building. Tickets are checked with particular care, and it is impossible to get inside without a special pass issued by the police. Pyotr Arkadyevich Stolypin himself is sitting in the front row of the stalls, in seat number 18. He is here not as a private individual, but as the head of government accompanying the monarch. He is calm, though a little tired. Next to him are the Minister of the Imperial Court, Baron Fredericks, and the land magnate, Count Pototsky. Behind the Prime Minister, a few steps away, stands his personal bodyguard, Officer Alexei Esaulov. Everything seems to be under control. But the security system, which appears so monolithic, has a fatal vulnerability. The name of this vulnerability is Dmitry Bogrov, a young man, an anarchist by conviction, and at the same time a secret agent of the Kiev Security Service. It was he who, using his status as an agent, obtained a pass to the theater. The head of the Kiev Okhrana, Nikolai Kulyabko, personally gave him a ticket, believing Bogrov's story. He reported that an assassination attempt was being planned by a group of SRs and that he, Bogrov, had to be in the theater to identify and neutralize the terrorist. It was a hoax that was brilliant in its simplicity and audacity. Kulyabko, eager to prove himself and prevent a terrorist attack, did not check the information properly and took his valuable agent at his word. Thus, the assassin entered the theater not secretly, not fighting his way in, but with the official permission of those who were supposed to protect his future victim. Bogrov was dressed in a tailcoat and carried himself confidently. He did not hide. During the second intermission, when the lights came on in the hall and the audience was strolling through the foyer, he began to act. He did not rush. He calmly walked down the aisle, approached Stolypin, who was standing with his back to him and talking to Baron Fredericks. The distance between them was minimal, 2 or 3 steps. None of the hundreds of security agents stationed around the hall paid any attention to him. To them, he was one of their own, a colleague carrying out an assignment. Even Yeselov's personal bodyguard, standing nearby, did not see any threat in the elegant young man. At that moment, the complex, multi-layered security system designed to protect the empire's top officials closed in on itself and failed. The mouse that had been let into the house to catch other mice turned out to be a wolf. All the preparations, all the cordons, all the checks were meaningless. The killer was already inside, and he was preparing to strike. Who was Dmitry Bogrov, the man whose name is forever etched in Russian history in black letters? To understand the motives behind his actions, one must look into his soul, which was full of contradictions. He was not like a typical revolutionary from the lower classes, embittered against the whole world. Mordecai Dmitry Gershkovich Bogrov was born in 1887 in Kiev, into a very wealthy and respected Jewish family. His father was a sworn attorney and owner of several profitable houses. The family lived in a luxurious apartment on Bibikovsky Boulevard. Dmitry received an excellent education, studied at the law faculty of Kiev University, and then continued his studies in Munich. He had access to all the benefits of life: money, travel, high society. It would seem that he had everything to live for. But it was precisely this prosperity that gave rise to existential boredom and contempt for bourgeois life. He sought thrills, vivid emotions, something that could tear him out of his gilded cage. And he found it in the revolutionary movement. While still a student, he became close to anarchist communists, the most radical and ruthless faction of revolutionaries. He was attracted by their cult of action, their contempt for all authority, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves. However, his participation in the movement was strange. He donated money to an anarchist newspaper, but rarely took part in actions himself. His comrades in the underground treated him with distrust, considering him a bourgeois son playing at revolution. This wounded his pride. In 1907, a key turning point in his life occurred. Bogrov voluntarily offered his services to the Kiev Security Department. Why? During interrogations, he claimed that he had become disillusioned with the revolution and wanted to fight terrorism. But his motives were probably more complex. His double life gave him what he craved: risk, power, and a sense of self-importance. He became a secret agent with a salary of 150 rubles, a huge amount of money at the time, although he did not need it. Under the pseudonym Alensky, he successfully betrayed his former anarchist and socialist revolutionary comrades to the Okhrana, preventing several terrorist attacks. His supervisor, the head of the Kiev Opera, Nikolai Kulyabko, considered him one of his most valuable agents. But by 1910, the game had become too dangerous. Rumors of his betrayal began to spread in revolutionary circles. He was in danger of being exposed and facing an inevitable death sentence from an underground tribunal. Bogrov found himself trapped. He found a truly diabolical way out. To rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the revolutionaries and at the same time go down in history, he decided to carry out a high-profile terrorist act: the murder of some prominent figure. Initially, he planned to kill Kulyabko, but then his ambitions grew. Stolypin himself became the target. This plan allowed him to solve all his problems with one shot. For the revolutionaries, he would become a heroic martyr who avenged his betrayed comrades. For history, he would be a man who changed its course. And for himself, he was committing the very great deed that would rid him of the boredom and insignificance of his own existence. During interrogation after the assassination attempt, he would say, "I lived a dull life, and I wanted to do something bright and memorable." It was suicide through murder, an act of vanity mixed with ideological fanaticism and deadly boredom. He was neither a passionate fighter for the happiness of the people, nor a cold-blooded agent provocateur carrying out someone else's orders. He was a product of his time, an era of decadence when human life had lost its value and the thirst for fame, even posthumous, became the main driving force. The fateful night of September 1st, 1911, at the Kiev Opera House, the second intermission of the opera, the tale of Tsar Sultan is coming to an end. The audience slowly returns to their seats. The lights come on in the hall. Pyotr Stolypin, standing at the barrier of the orchestra pit, turns and takes a few steps back to his seat in the front row. He chats with the court minister Baron Fredericks and Count Pototsky. At that very moment, Dmitry Bogrov appears from the aisle between the rows. He is dressed in a tailcoat and holds a theater program in his hand. His movements are calm and unhurried. None of the guards pay any attention to him. He is one of them, an agent on duty. He approaches Stolypin, coming almost within touching distance. The distance between them is no more than 2 or 3 meters. Suddenly, he throws away the program, under which he was hiding a Browning pistol. The first shot rings out. The sharp, deafening bang is drowned out by the hubbub of voices and music, but many hear it. The bullet hits Stolypin in the right arm, passes through and wounds a violinist in the orchestra pit. The Prime Minister flinches, but remains standing. He looks at Bogrov in surprise, as if unable to believe what is happening. Bogrov, without hesitation, fires a second shot. This shot proves fatal. The bullet hits Stolypin in the chest, piercing the Order of St. Vladimir, shattering his liver and lodging in his body. Stolypin slowly sinks into a chair. There is no fear or pain on his face, only confusion and a kind of heavy fatigue. He unbuttons his jacket, sees a huge bloody wound on his chest, and utters his last historic phrase, addressing the royal box: "I am happy to die for the Tsar." Panic breaks out in the hall. There are screams, shouts, and a stampede. People, not understanding what has happened, rush to the exits. Tsar Nicholas II, hearing the shots, comes out into the box and looks down. He sees Stolypin, pale and slumped in his chair, and the crowd rushing toward the assassin. The guards, who had been completely inactive until that moment, finally come to their senses. Several people, including Yeselov's personal bodyguard and random spectators, pounce on Bogrov. They knock him to the floor and begin to beat him. Someone shouts, "Lynch him!" Bogrov does not resist. His mission is accomplished. Stolypin, who is still conscious, is picked up and carried out of the hall. He is immediately taken to the Makovsky Brothers Clinic, one of the best in Kiev. Meanwhile, chaos reigns in the theater. The performance is interrupted. The orchestra begins to play the national anthem, "God Save the Tsar," to calm the crowd. The entire hall stands and sings, turning toward the royal box. It is a surreal moment of national unity in the face of tragedy. A unity that, as it turns out, will be the last. While doctors fought for the Prime Minister's life, and the beaten Bogrov was taken away for his first interrogation, the main question was already forming in many people's minds. How could this have happened in the most secure place in the empire, in front of hundreds of agents? Was it the act of a lone terrorist, or was there someone else behind him? The chronicle of that night recorded the facts, but left out the motives and secret forces that led to the disaster. The first shot fired in the Kiev Opera House was like a clap of thunder in a clear sky. But it was not the kind of thunder that makes everyone immediately fall to the ground. Witnesses describe it differently. A dry pop, the crack of a chair breaking, the sound of binoculars falling. In the crowded, buzzing hall, where the echoes of music and conversation had not yet died down, the sound was not immediately recognized as a gunshot. It was this split-second delay, this collective confusion, that cost Stolypin his life. The killer's weapon was a 7-shot self-loading Browning pistol, model 1900, caliber 7.65 mm. It was a popular, reliable, and powerful weapon, favored by both special services and terrorists throughout Europe. Bogrov approached Stolypin, coming within 2 or 3 steps, and fired the first shot. The bullet entered the Prime Minister's right hand when he, perhaps instinctively, tried to cover himself or make some kind of gesture. Passing through, it did not lose its energy, ricocheted and wounded the violinist Anton Burglar, who was sitting in the orchestra pit. This fact, confirmed by ballistic analysis, proves the incredibly close distance between the assassin and his victim. According to eyewitnesses, Stolypin himself did not react to the first shot as if it were an assassination attempt. He flinched, looked at his bloodied hand with an expression of bewilderment, and then turned his gaze to Bogrov. There was no fear in his eyes, but rather surprise and a question. He did not fall or scream, but remained standing tall and straight, as if unable to believe what was happening. It was in those precious moments, between 1 and 3 seconds, that the security system failed completely and fatally. Stolypin's personal bodyguard, Captain Esolov, who was standing nearby, did not react. Hundreds of Okhrana agents stationed throughout the hall remained silent. Why? According to one version, they simply did not understand what had happened, mistaking the bang for everyday noise. According to another, more sinister version, they were paralyzed when they saw that the shooter was their colleague, Agent Alensky, who, according to their information, was there to prevent a terrorist attack. They were waiting for a signal from him, but he himself became a threat. This delay allowed Bogrov to do what would have been unthinkable in any other situation: take aim and fire a second shot. The first shot was just a prelude. It was not fatal. It only wounded. But it did the main thing. It broke through the wall of security and time, creating the perfect conditions for the decisive blow. An analysis of this moment shows that Stolypin's assassination was made possible not so much by the assassin's cunning as by the complete paralysis of those who were supposed to protect him. It was the second shot that turned the assassination attempt into murder and gave rise to the main mystery of this tragedy. While the first shot is more or less clear, the second is shrouded in a fog of contradictory evidence and versions that still stir the minds of historians. Did it even happen? And if so, who fired it? The official version, based on Bogrov's own testimony and the autopsy results, states that Bogrov, taking advantage of the confusion after the first shot, fired a second shot almost immediately. This bullet hit Stolypin in the right side of his chest, piercing the Order of St. Vladimir, which, ironically, was made of fragile porcelain rather than metal, and only slightly altered its trajectory. The bullet shattered his liver, damaged his diaphragm, and lodged in his retroperitoneal tissue. It was a fatal wound. However, this seemingly coherent version begins to fall apart upon closer examination. Many witnesses who were in the hall, including those who were standing very close by, claimed that they heard only one bang. Others spoke of two, but with a very short interval, almost like a double shot. The question arises, could Bogrov, not being a professional marksman, in a state of emotional distress, shoot a second time so quickly and accurately when people were already rushing towards him? The most enduring and intriguing conspiracy theory is that there was a second shot, but it was not fired by Bogrov. Or, at least not only by him. Supporters of this version point to several strange circumstances. First, the bullet extracted from Stolypin's body was never submitted for a full ballistic examination, which could have proven beyond a doubt that it was fired from Bogrov's Browning. Second, some witnesses mentioned a second man in a tailcoat, who was allegedly standing next to Bogrov and disappeared in the commotion. Who was this person? Could it have been a second shooter acting in concert with Bogrov to cover him? One of the side boxes, or even the passageway in the orchestra pit, has been suggested as a possible location for the second sniper. A professional shooter could have fired an accurate shot under the cover of the general panic caused by the first bang. This version also explains the strange inaction of the security guards. Perhaps they were ordered not to intervene in order to allow the second force to finish what it had started. Who could have been behind this hypothetical conspiracy? Theories point to Stolypin's enemies, either extreme right-wing monarchists who used Bogrov blindly, or, even more frightening, the top brass of the Okhrana itself, who decided to eliminate a prime minister who was too powerful and independent with the help of their own agent. The second shot thus turns from a simple fact into a symbol. It becomes a metaphorical second bottom of this case, hinting that the visible perpetrator, Dmitry Bogrov, was only a pawn in someone else's much more complex and terrifying game. Myth or reality? Without new documents, which may be lost forever in the archives, it is impossible to give a definitive answer. But the very persistence of this mystery shows how deep the distrust of the official version was, and how many people in Russia believed that someone else was behind Stolypin's assassination. As soon as the second, fatal shot rang out, the fragile shell of order at the Kiev Opera House burst. The hall erupted in panic. Eyewitness accounts paint a picture of utter chaos. People who had been watching the events in bewilderment rushed toward the exits. Women screamed, men pushed each other aside, trying to make their way through the crowd. A stampede began. One of the eyewitnesses, publicist Vasily Shulgin, later recalled, "The crowd rushed backward. A solid stream of people in which nothing could be distinguished swept me along." There were screams of horror. Two figures remained in the center of this hurricane. Stolypin, mortally wounded, slumped in his chair, and his assassin, Dmitry Bogrov. Finally, they pounced on him. The first to attack were not security guards, but ordinary spectators, officers, students, and officials sitting nearby. They knocked Bogrov to the floor and began to beat him brutally. Some beat him with their fists, others with the hilts of their swords. A furious cry rang out over the crowd. "Tear him apart! Lynch him!" It was a primitive thirst for revenge, a spontaneous lynching. The guards and police, coming to their senses, rushed to rescue the murderer from the angry crowd. They managed to pull him away, beaten and with a broken face, and dragged him into one of the theater rooms for initial questioning. According to those who led him away, Bogrov was completely calm and even seemed satisfied. When asked why he did it, he allegedly replied, "I didn't want to kill him, just scare him." This was a clear lie intended to confuse the investigation from the outset. The reaction of Tsar Nicholas II, who watched the tragedy from his box, was remarkably restrained. He showed no visible emotion. When Stolypin, supported by his arms, was carried out of the hall, he saw the Tsar and made a last attempt to bless him by crossing himself over the box. According to witnesses, Nicholas II merely bowed silently. Later, when the panic had subsided somewhat, the orchestra, on someone's orders, began to play the national anthem, "God Save the Tsar." The entire hall rose as one and, turning toward the royal box, began to sing. It was a powerful, tragic moment of national unity, but it could no longer change anything. While the wounded prime minister was being taken to the clinic, where doctors began a desperate but hopeless struggle for his life, investigators were already at work in the theater. They questioned witnesses and collected evidence. But the main witness and perpetrator, Dmitry Bogrov, was already in the hands of the Okhrana. And now the main question was whether he would talk, and, more importantly, whether he would be allowed to talk. The chaos of that night concealed many details, clues, and possibly accomplices. The panic became the perfect smokescreen behind which the real organizers, if there were any, could cover their tracks. Immediately after the assassination attempt, the seriously wounded Stolypin was taken to the Makovsky brothers' private surgical clinic on Malo-Vladimirskaya Street, considered the best in Kiev. He was immediately surrounded by the city's best doctors, who were urgently joined by specialists called in from St. Petersburg. The first night gave rise to cautious hope. Despite his severe injury, the bullet had shattered his liver and lodged in his body. Stolypin was fully conscious, maintained remarkable self-control, and even tried to joke with the doctors. He asked detailed questions about the nature of his injury and whether any vital organs had been damaged. His pulse was steady, and his temperature did not rise. It seemed that his powerful physique and unyielding will could defeat death. News reports about his condition were full of cautious optimism. All of Russia held its breath as it followed the bulletins on the Prime Minister's health. Prayers for his recovery were held in churches throughout the country. However, despite the patient's outward calm, the doctors understood the gravity of the situation. A liver injury at that time was practically a death sentence due to inevitable internal bleeding and a high risk of peritonitis, an inflammation of the peritoneum. Antibiotics did not yet exist, and any infection could be fatal. Tsar Nicholas II visited the wounded prime minister in the clinic the day after the assassination attempt. The visit was brief and, according to reports, rather formal. The emperor stayed at Stolypin's bedside for no more than 10 minutes. This restraint, this lack of visible sympathy on the part of the monarch whom Stolypin served faithfully, struck many contemporaries and gave rise to rumors that the Tsar was secretly even glad to get rid of such a powerful and authoritative minister. The crisis came on the third day. Stolypin's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. His temperature rose, his pulse became rapid and weak. It became clear that internal bleeding and infection were doing their dirty work. The Council of Doctors decided on surgery as a last, desperate measure, but it was already too late. Stolypin began to lose consciousness. He spent his last hours delirious. On September 5, 1911, at 10 p.m., without regaining consciousness, Pyotr Arkadyevich Stolypin died. His 4-day struggle for life was over. He did not die in battle or in the political arena, but on a hospital bed, a victim not only of a terrorist's bullet, but also of the state of medicine at the time. His death came as a shock to the country, but for many in the upper echelons, it was a quiet relief. The last reformer of the Russian Empire was gone, and with him went the hope for peaceful transformation of the country. The investigation into Stolypin's murder began literally minutes after the shots were fired, and was conducted with unprecedented speed. However, its main goal was not so much to uncover all the circumstances of the crime, as to quickly convict and execute the only accused, Dmitry Bogrov. This created the impression that the authorities were trying not to investigate, but rather to bury the case along with the main witness. Bogrov's main interrogations took place in the Kosoy Kaponir fortress in Kiev. He behaved with remarkable composure during them. He refused the services of a lawyer and remained confident, even displaying a certain degree of theatricality. His testimony was full of contradictions. At first, he claimed that he only wanted to wound Stolypin in order to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the revolutionaries. Then he claimed that he acted alone, out of ideological considerations, as an anarchist who hated all authority. He categorically denied the existence of accomplices or instigators. The investigators seemed quite satisfied with this version. They did not dig deeper, did not thoroughly check his connections, or find out where he got his information about the Prime Minister's movements. At the same time, another unofficial investigation was underway into the failure of the Okhrana. Those primarily responsible for security in Kiev, Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs Pavel Kurlov, head of the Palace Guard Alexander Spiridovich, and head of the Kiev Security Department Nikolai Kulyabko, found themselves at the center of the scandal. They gave confusing explanations, shifting the blame onto each other. Kulyabko claimed that he trusted his agent, Dmitry Bogrov, and acted on instructions. Kurlov stated that he was not fully aware of the details of the operation. Their excuses seemed unconvincing and only reinforced suspicions of negligence or even malicious intent. However, they did not receive any serious punishment. They were removed from their posts, but soon all of them received new, albeit less significant, appointments. This striking leniency towards people who had failed to protect the second most important person in the state became another argument in favor of the conspiracy theory. Bogrov's trial was record-breakingly quick and closed to the public. The military district court sat for just one night, from September 9th to 10. The press and the public were not allowed into the courtroom. Bogrov was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The entire trial took less than a day. There was no thorough examination of the evidence, no summoning of key witnesses, no attempt to understand the motives. The impression was that the system was in a hurry to get rid of an inconvenient killer who could have revealed too much. The investigation and the court left the main questions unanswered. How did an Okhrana agent become the Prime Minister's killer? Why did the entire state security system fail? Did Bogrov act alone, or was he merely a tool in someone else's hands? Instead of answers, the public received a quick verdict and a sense of great state secrecy. The speed with which Dmitry Bogrov was convicted and executed is still astonishing today. Only 10 days passed between the shots fired in the Opera House and the execution of the death sentence. On the night of September 12-13, 1911, he was hanged in the courtyard of a Kiev prison on Lysaya Gora. Such haste was completely uncharacteristic of the political trials of that time. Trials of terrorists usually lasted for months. The investigation carefully gathered evidence and tried to uncover the entire network of conspirators. Here, everything happened with lightning speed. Why were they in such a hurry? The official explanation was simple. The state wanted to demonstrate its strength and determination in the fight against terror, as well as to calm public opinion, which had been stirred up by the daring murder. The swift execution was supposed to serve as a lesson to all revolutionaries and show that retribution was inevitable. However, this version does not stand up to scrutiny. On the contrary, the hasty and closed trial only reinforced suspicions and gave rise to a flood of rumors. The main conspiracy theory, which emerged almost immediately, was that Bogrov was executed so quickly so that he would not have time to talk. He was not just an executor, but a key witness who could have named his high-ranking patrons if he had any. His death was beneficial to those who may have been behind him, whether it was influential court circles who wanted to get rid of Stolypin, or the top brass of the Okhrana itself, who decided to get rid of their overly independent boss with the help of their own agent provocateur. The living Bogrov was a time bomb. He could have given testimony that would have caused a huge political scandal and destroyed the careers of many people in power. The dead Bogrov was convenient for everyone. He took his secret to the grave, allowing the investigation to close the case and write it off as the work of a lone fanatic. Interestingly, according to witnesses, Bogrov himself met his death with complete calm. He refused to confess and did not ask for clemency. His last words were not addressed to God or the Tsar, but to history. He wanted to go down in history with a bang, and he succeeded. His quick execution was the final act in this tragedy, an act that finally closed the curtain on one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Instead of shedding light on the truth, it only deepened the darkness. The main question, who gave the second decisive order, to pull the trigger or to silence the killer, remains unanswered. The question of whether Dmitry Bogrov was a lone fanatic or merely a pawn in someone else's game became central to everyone who tried to understand the tragedy. For 100 years, historians and publicists have offered two main, mutually exclusive versions. The first version is the official one, which was accepted by the investigation from the outset. According to this version, Bogrov acted alone. His motives were a complex mixture of ideological anarchism, wounded pride, and a desire to escape the trap he had fallen into by becoming a double agent. He wanted to redeem himself in the eyes of the revolutionaries who already suspected him of treason, and at the same time go down in history as the man who destroyed the chief hangman and reactionary. This version is convenient and simple. It removes responsibility from the state apparatus, reducing the tragedy to the actions of a single madman. It is supported by Bogrov's own testimony, who insisted until the end that he acted alone, as well as the lack of direct evidence pointing to accomplices. But it is precisely in this simplicity that its weakness lies. The second version is a conspiracy theory. It has many branches, but the essence is the same. Bogrov was only a tool. The question is, in whose hands? The most popular and plausible version of this theory points to the top echelons of the Okhrana itself and the extreme right-wing, monarchist circles close to it. Supporters of this version believe that the head of the Kiev Security Department, Kulyabko, and his patron, the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, Kurlov, deliberately turned a blind eye to the assassination attempt, or even helped organize it. The motive? Stolypin had become too powerful and too independent. He had begun investigating corruption in the Okhrana, threatening the careers of many of its leaders. His reforms were unpopular with conservatives at court, and his conflict with Rasputin made him an enemy of the Empress. Eliminating the prime minister with the help of an agent provocateur solved all the problems. It got rid of Stolypin and at the same time discredited the revolutionary movement. The arguments in favor of this version are compelling. The inexplicable negligence of the security guards at the theater. Bogrov was given a pass without any verification of his identity. The remarkably lenient punishment for Kurlov and Kulyabko, who were simply removed from their posts. And, of course, the hasty, almost indecent execution of Bogrov, which did not give him a chance to tell the whole truth. There was another, less popular version of the conspiracy. Allegedly, Bogrov was ordered by his former revolutionary comrades, who sentenced him to death for treason and forced him to atone for his guilt with blood by committing a high-profile terrorist act. However, this version is unlikely. Revolutionary organizations usually proudly took responsibility for such actions, but in this case, they all disowned Bogrov. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Perhaps there was no direct order to kill Stolypin, but an atmosphere of hatred, intrigue, and permissiveness was created in which high-ranking officials of the Okhrana, wishing to curry favor or frame their rivals, played with fire, using their agents blindly. they created a situation in which murder became possible. And when it happened, they did everything to hide their monstrous incompetence, or worse, criminal intent. Stolypin's assassination was the stone that triggered the avalanche that brought down the old Russia. The consequences of this tragedy were not just significant, they were fatal for the empire. The first and most obvious result was the immediate and complete reversal of all his reformist initiatives. Stolypin was the only politician in Nicholas II's entourage who had a clear vision of the future, a strategic plan, and the unyielding will to implement it. His famous agrarian reform, designed to create a class of strong, independent peasant landowners and thereby extinguish the flames of revolution, was his main brainchild. After his death, it was effectively rolled back. The new appointees who replaced him were either colorless bureaucrats or outright reactionaries who did not understand or did not want to understand the essence of his reforms. The phrase, "Give the state 20 years of peace and you will not recognize Russia," turned out to be prophetic, but with a negative sign. There was no peace. The Prime Minister's death radically changed the balance of power at court. The only man who could speak to the Tsar as an equal, argue with him, and, most importantly, resist the influence of dark, behind-the-scenes forces, was gone. The power vacuum that formed after his death was immediately filled by court intriguers, Black Hundreds, and, of course, Grigory Rasputin. The influence of the holy old man on the Empress, and through her on the Emperor, became absolute. The so-called ministerial merry-go-round began when ministers were changed with kaleidoscopic speed, not based on their competence, but on their degree of loyalty to Rasputin. State administration was paralyzed, and corruption reached unprecedented levels. In the long term, Stolypin's assassination became a point of no return. Many historians agree that this was Russia's last real chance for peaceful, evolutionary modernization. Stolypin tried to carry out reforms from above to prevent a revolution from below. His death showed that the ruling class was incapable of self-preservation and renewal. The shots fired in Kiev were a signal to the whole society. Compromise was impossible, and political problems in Russia were not solved in parliament, but with the help of a Browning. This event finally radicalized both the left and the right, deepened the gap between the authorities and the people, and paved the way for the disasters of 1917. The empire lost its last statesman and was left with a Tsar who did not know how to rule, and a people who no longer wanted to obey him. More than 100 years have passed, and the mystery of Stolypin's death remains unsolved. Why, despite the huge number of memoirs, studies, and even the opening of some archives, are we still unable to answer the main question with any certainty? Who was behind the murder? The reason is that from the very beginning, this case was shrouded in a fog of misinformation, rumors, and deliberate concealment of evidence. Key documents that could have shed light on the truth were either destroyed immediately after the assassination or irretrievably lost in the fires of the revolution and the Civil War. The transcripts of Bogrov's interrogations, reports from agents on the mood in revolutionary circles, correspondence between the leaders of the Okhrana. Most of this invaluable material has disappeared. What remains is often contradictory and incomplete. Historians are forced to work like archaeologists, piecing together a picture of the past from fragments. In addition, Stolypin's assassination almost immediately became a myth that every political force used for its own purposes. For monarchists and conservatives, he became a holy martyr, the last knight of the empire who fell at the hands of a Jewish Masonic conspiracy. In this worldview, Bogrov was merely the executor of the will of some secret forces hostile to Russia. For Soviet historiography, on the contrary, Stolypin was a hangman, and strangler of freedom, and his killer Bogrov, albeit a confused one, was a revolutionary hero. The truth about the role of the Okhrana, its double game and provocations, was carefully hushed up as it cast a shadow on the methods of struggle that were later actively used by the Soviet authorities. This ideological struggle surrounding the tragedy prevented objective analysis. Today's historians, free from ideological blinders, approach the issue in a more balanced way. Most of them agree that there is no direct, irrefutable evidence of a conspiracy involving high-ranking officials. However, the lone terrorist theory also does not stand up to scrutiny. The most likely version seems to be criminal negligence bordering on malicious intent on the part of the leadership of the Kiev Opera. Krylov and Kulyabko, at the very least, created all the conditions for the murder by taking their agent at his word and failing to take any security measures. And after the tragedy, they did everything they could to cover up their guilt, rushing to execute the main witness. Was there someone else behind them? Perhaps. But without new archival findings, this will remain in the realm of speculation. The mystery of Stolypin's death is not just an old detective story. It is a mirror reflecting all the deadly diseases that were eating away at the Russian Empire. The paralysis of power, the irresponsibility of the elites, the omnipotence of the secret police, and the deepest divisions in society. The answer to the question, who killed Stolypin, is important not only for understanding the past, it is important for understanding how easily a great country can fall into the abyss when it loses the people capable of leading it forward.